Hello and welcome to Sim.bc, where right now is 17:29, and whilst recording yesterday with me Throatek didn't make it worse, it didn't make it better. And that is probably why I haven't released one of my kind of discussion slash podcasty-ish videos as of yet, as I want to do at least once a month. So I have one in the making, I have a script for it, bear with me, it's gonna go up there, right? I'm just going to wait until I can actually record it and be happy with it, which probably will be later on this week, which will be very closely to the end of the month, but we're gonna make it, mates, we're gonna make it. And something interesting I also realized today was that, well, I actually don't have a throat burn, I have a throat ache based on that I'm like dried out in my throat. I don't really know what that's called, but like dried throat or whatever. So I had to run down to the local pharmaceutical store and ask for new drugs, basically, legal drugs. I don't know what it's called otherwise. Pharmaceuticals? Maybe that's what it's called. Anyway, medicine. Yeah, that's what it's called. Obviously. Oh, I should have thought about that in yesterday's video. So I had to run down and ask for some new medicine. And they were like, weren't you here yesterday? And I was like, yeah, I kind of was. And isn't it the most irritating thing that when you find someone that you think look good, so to say, a beautiful person, right, that you probably want to ask out at some point or another, you find them in these kinds of situations, yeah? When I'm running in there and my first line is basically, hi, so I'm sick. And this beautiful woman is sitting there on the other side of the counter looking at me and being like, well, we have all different kinds of creams and pills. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, you can't really lead into, I think you're beautiful, do you want to go for a coffee? When you've started with saying, hi, my mucus has started turning green. See what I'm saying? It's not the same thing at all. Which is unfortunate because, it's the what should we say, the unfairness of life, I assume, that when you find someone that you think like, oh, I could go for a coffee with you, mate, and try to like work on this. It happens and tends to be in these kinds of situations when you start with something as unrealistically bad and unproportionately bad, I'd say, as my mucus has this kind of smell and density and feel to it. What's your name? I mean, it doesn't really work. Anyway, and they also asked me like, oh, wow, you're here again, and now you're saying it's something else. Have you been Googling your symptoms? And I'm like, no. Yes, I have. And it helped. It turns out that it helped. Anyway, that is not why you are here. Now is it? No. You're here because we're going to talk about that project. What is evil? And you're here because we're going to talk about the sub-project. Yeah? The 7 deadly sins. And which sin are we going to talk about today? Which one are we going to take on today? One of the more concrete ones. We've had wrath, we've had sloth, we've had no, we haven't. We have gluttony and we had envy. And we have 2 left, which is greed and pride. And we're gonna finish off with pride tomorrow, yeah? So we're gonna take greed today. One of the ones that are, yet again, common when it comes to evil. Not as common as gluttony, for some reason, right? Which I think is ludicrous, because I think that greed should have a stronger connection to evil than many of the others, especially in relation to gluttony. But apparently that isn't the case based on what I've found. So what is greed? Going into it, and you probably all heard that you shouldn't be controlled by greed. Yet again, going back to this idea of self-discipline, you should be self-disciplined enough to not actually give into greed. You shouldn't do that. You should be able to control yourself. Yeah? You should be able to control yourself, not to overconsume, because that's basically what greed is. Just like all of the others, when you actually boil it down, yeah, it's the acquiring of more things than you need. You shouldn't bark for too much, you shouldn't bite for too much, you shouldn't run and collect too much things, you shouldn't have too much of anything, you should have lagom. No, but you should have exactly the right amount. You shouldn't have more, right? You shouldn't have more than you actually need, and that's the kind of idea that greed comes into. And I would say that, just a side note, that in today's society, when you get, what you would say, discounts for buying more things because of economies of scale and all of that. Yeah, society probably tends to push a kind of a greed mindset onto you as a consumer. However, that is not what we're going to talk about. Basically, it could be what we're going to talk about. Talking about that different corporations are pushing a certain point of view and a certain mindset onto consumers, which basically leads them to buy more than they need, leading to them throw away more than they, should have done otherwise, because they bought too much, because they think that they're saving on buying more, but they don't really. And when they're buying more, the redistribution of wealth and food on the planet is, all out of whack, because it's unproportional towards the people who can actually buy it, based on where the corporation's own base is, based on where they have attained these economies of scale, so that they can actually produce more for less resources for each individual input. Anyway, I'm even boring myself. Am I? No, not really. I think that thing is enjoyable as... I like that, I can say. Now in my ballpark, right? But we should move out towards that again, to move out from that ballpark again, because that's just social criticism, right? That's all we read about in school. All we're talking about is that, you should have an ethical mindset when it comes to corporations, and this kind of mindset that they're pushing greed onto the consumer. Sure, but we're basically talking about the greed and what it is. So, unfortunately, kind of segue out there for a while, yeah, but we're coming back. So greed is basically, yet again, the overconsumption of something, that you're acquiring more than you necessarily need to. The naked greed, so to say, the naked wanting of something. And I would yet again tend to do it as envy. When you see someone who is envious and they get something because they're envious, instead of that, kind of an external motivation to why they get something. They feel a negative emotion even when they acquire their goal. Simultaneously, or rather in relation to, or in contrast to, when they have an internal goal they've set for themselves and they acquire the same thing, but for an internal goal, they will feel positively about it. Same thing can ish be applied for greed. I didn't find anyone who actually applied this to greed, but I think that it can be applied to greed after watching, or after reading through and reading up on the other sins and the other things that we've been talking about, which is of course the reason for this entire project, making some connections. Yeah. So I would argue, right, that greed, when it comes to feeling that, how do you know that you've overconsumed? How do you know that you've taken more than you need to? And I would say that it's, based on marginal utility. Oh yes, we're going back to them economic terms. And marginal utility is basically how much utility, how much, how can you rephrase that if you don't know what utility is, but how much worth do you get out of it? How much happiness, so to say, how much use do you get out of one unit? When you increase the amounts of units that you have. So for each individual unit, how much, happiness, we can say, or utility then, do you get out of each unit that you pile on? And at a certain point, these tend to be negative. They tend to be inverted U-shapes, let's say, and they tend to increase very much. So if you don't have any apples at all, your first apple is going to be amazing. Next apple is going to be pretty good, and a third apple is going to be great, and then like the 50th apple is going to be like, I'm equal, and then it's going to go downwards. So you're like, I'm piling on more and more apples, and it's not increasing by as much as it used to do, right? But it's still positive until you reach the breaking point of the x-axis, and it starts being a negative marginal utility that you actually pile on. Which means that you can come to a point where it's going to feel negative, and it's going to be negative for you to actually pile on more and more stuff. So basically, going back to the envy part, as I was trying to connect this to, is that you will probably feel a positive correlation to your feelings and your behavior when you are acquiring things in a regular pace, a normal pace, a natural pace, a pace in which you can actually utilize things. However, when you're over-consuming, when you reach that overconsumption, that acquiring too much of something, actually moving into greed, you will have a negative relationship to that, or rather to those units, in the sense that your utility that you will get out of it is actually negative. It will worsen your overall life experience and your overall everyday life experience for acquiring another unit of this kind. And I'd say that is the breaking point for greed. That is when you realize what greed actually is all about. So let's take that up in an example. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, did I not think about an example before I did this. But let's take apples, yeah? When we're talking about apples, we can work with that, right? We can work with that. I'm believing in me, mind you. So if you're having a unit of apples, let's say you're having one apple, yet again, one apple is good. You're getting a huge utility, you're getting huge happiness, you're getting food, right? You're happy about it. And let's say that you can consume, you yourself, your family, your friends, however big the group is that is actually consuming these apples, is about 100 apples, given that one apple is 1 unit. So you can consume 100 units of apples before it actually goes negative. However, when you start to consuming that 101 apple, you're not actually consuming it anymore. You've just acquired it, but the apple will go bad before someone consumes it. Hence, you have wasted resources. You haven't only wasted on a quotation mark, you have wasted resources in buying an additional apple that isn't actually going to be consumed. This, in turn, leads to that you have gathered more than you can chew. Like you bark for more than you can chew. You've taken more than you actually need. So what basically happens in this example, let's say that everybody eats 1 apple and that's just the limit to how much they consume. And you are 100 people, you have 100 apples. And then you buy an additional apple on top of all of this. You have 101. This means that each person is consuming 1 apple and 1 apple is left out. This apple will not be consumed. It will just go bad. It will be moldy. It will be thrown away. It will not be used. Hence, your utility in society, right, has been lowered because 1, you've wasted resources on actually buying this additional apple that you didn't use. And 2, you didn't get any utility out of it, which is basically a segue part on that. And 3, then you actually need to throw it away, which means that you probably need to invest some form of resources, either if it's time, if it's manpower, if it's just finding a new place to actually put it. You need to throw that away and deal with this moldy apple in some way. So you're actually going to need to utilize resources in order to, what can we say, scale away your greed that brought this on you. Kind of a really simplified example, but it's all I could make on such short notice, right? Because I actually hadn't thought about a topic or an example of that yet, which is kind of bad since I've been thinking about this since yesterday. And I know that I could have been talking about, because I was thinking about different examples, and all of those examples that I thought about kind of stepped on people's toes. That were kind of insensitive because they were making huge generalization about the population, about, you know, people overall, which is never good. It could be good at sometimes. We're actually going to discuss that, but anyway, so I tended not to use them, so that is why we used the apples once, right? Could have been bananas, could have been melons, could have been whatever you want. Just throw in a fruit, just throw in something that you can consume. It can be meatballs, right? That Swedish culture is shining right through. Could be fika. Anyway, mates. How is this then connecting into evil? Because you might say that, yeah, that is basically just greed, but greed is the overconsumption, right? And yet again, I'm not putting that much time onto this because it's basically what we've been discussing with all of them. Because it is a running theme. The theme of, well, the sin, or so to say, the problem that stands is based on your own person, that you don't, or you're not self-disciplined enough to actually deal with it, right? That's the basis of what we've been discussing, why this exists in the beginning, in the first place. However, the thing that actually connects this to evil is that you're consuming and you're acquiring resources, which makes the distribution of resources in the world disproportionate to the need of where those resources needs to be, which makes it so that when you're acquiring resources, when you are utilizing resources, when you're consuming resources, it's on the expense of someone else in the world. Basically, if I'm spending more resources than I need, if we say that there's a finite number of resources per person, let's say that each person have 100 resources acquired to them on Earth, right? That exists out there in a renewable fashion without us exhausting any form of natural resource or anything like that. Let's say that every person has 100 resources to be acquired. If I start acquiring 110 resources, that means someone else will only get 90, right? It will be someone else will suffer, or that 10 people will only get 99. But somehow you can't actually change this, right? Because we have a finite amount of resources in the world, given that we don't exhaust anything. But even if we do put in the concept of exhausting a resource, it well, basically just means that perhaps we can uphold this unnatural consumption behavior, but in the long run it's going to disappear and everybody will be hurt by it anyway. So that's not good either. That's actually technically is an option, but it shouldn't be an option, right? It shouldn't be an option in the long run. However, the basis is that I'm consuming more than I need to. That's on the expense of someone else. It might not be my neighbor, it might not be anyone in my town, might not even be anyone on my continent, but somewhere and somewhere is not going to be able to acquire these resources because I'm doing so. And that is the kind of the connection to evil. I can argue, yes, that is a connection to evil. That is true. That is an evil behavior, actually consuming more than you need to, especially if you know about it. However, simultaneously, I have a DSLR, I have a computer, I'm having a phone that I'm changing like every 2 years. Is that actually a sustainable consumption behavior? That is a big thing in today's business ethics and in today's corporate social responsibility and sustainability overall, and we're talking about it in economics. Is this actually something that you can sustain in the long run? Is this actually possible and plausible? But however, as I said in the beginning, talking about corporations actually pushing this consumption behavior onto us as consumers, we've been shaped into follow this consumption behavior culture, no matter if we want to or not, basically pushing this idea of greed onto us and connecting it to evil. So can we say that everybody's evil then because everybody's consuming, or how are we going to go about that? Because everybody's doing it one way, so everybody's in accordance with that this is kind of okay, right? So going against that should be evil, right? So stop consuming should be evil if we're basing it on that what everybody else is doing is right and what the individual does is wrong, which we can't, obviously. Anyway, that's things that we're going to talk about in the review, but the basis of it is that what makes it evil is that you're consuming on someone else's behavior and on someone else's expense. We're going to discuss this in the review because, as I've seen, it's a common theme, and especially in the mini review after the 7 deadly sins that I'm going to take up. Anyway, mates, I've been rambling on for way too long. I'm feeling kind of good in my throat, actually, you can argue. So have a nice one. I'll see you tomorrow with the one sin that I love discussing the most. It's all going to be about pride and principles. Principles probably isn't part of it, but I'm gonna take it up anyway because I think that it is related to it. Have a nice one, mates, and I'll see you tomorrow in probably one of the most passionate and longest videos there are ever gonna be if I can't contain myself, which I hopefully can. Have a nice one, mates. See you tomorrow.